Well, welcome back to the Cinema of Transformation. This week's movie is A Beautiful Mind. Now, you've probably heard the quote that there's a fine line between genius and insanity. Well, this guy, John Nash, pretty much obliterates that line between genius and insanity, and we'll see how this all develops and unfolds, falls apart, and comes back together, because what we're talking about is fragmentation. There is a notion that at certain points in your life, maybe under extreme stress or trauma, that part of you gets broken off and fragmented, that you're not quite whole. It gets broken up. Some people lose touch with their inner child, and they do work later on in their middle ages to get that back and get back in touch with that. Another thing we know is that through the physical act of physical maturity, physiological, that is anatomically, when we change through the puberty rites of being a child to being a biological adult, that part of us, we sometimes lose touch with that. And we have to, because that part has to die so that the mature part can live. But if it's not let go in a healthy way, it might be hanging around and calling for attention, and it might rear its head later on. So that is one example of a piece of you breaking off when you meet a threshold or some other transformative rite of passage. And with these fragments, they become real. They become so strong that Nash sees them as being real people, not just imaginary friends in his life. And they're not really imaginary because he feels that they're real, and they're not really friends because they honestly don't really help him out that much. So this is about that, about floating in between fantasy and reality and not being sure which is which. And finally, with fragmentation, the cure for that is reintegration, that these pieces that have been broken off get pulled back in some way, or at least satisfied to where they're not really being a difficulty for you. And in doing this, there is redemption. So this is basically, it's a rise and a really hard fall and a really hard rise again, return, redemption for this guy's life. And so this is A Beautiful Mind, 2001. Best Picture, Ron Howard was the director. Best Director Oscar as well. I think his partner, Brian Grazer, got the producing award for Best Picture. Very successful, really good role for the lead actor, who normally does, Russell Crowe normally does more action or epic like Gladiator and things like that. This is, he's playing a mathematician, so a little out of typecast, but he does a fantastic job playing the role. Now, as I mentioned before about having pieces of your soul, I guess, in the discipline of shamanism, that this soul loss occurs when very dramatic, very traumatic events in your life transpire. And the cure for soul loss is soul retrieval, makes sense. And that's a shamanic process and practice of really inviting these broken pieces to come back. A little bit different than what happens here in Beautiful Mind. This is a little, but it's like it. So I wanted to mention that. More specifically, this is what Carl Jung called being possessed by an archetype. That is, you identify so much with a part of your personality, just an aspect, say like, people say, well, I'm always a bridesmaid, never a winner. Always come in second place. That's the story of my life. Well, if you really believe that and make it the story of your life, it will be that. So that is in a small way being possessed by an archetype or a principle that you think that you are. And for Nash, these archetypal factors show up as real people in his life. They become so crystallized that they actually appear to him to be real. So that's this possession of this archetypal energy that grasps you, and you don't really know who you are and who these archetypes are. And this is what we will follow along with with our main character, the hero, John Nash. Now, he's a brilliant mathematician. We have another math guy this week, in addition to Good Will Hunting. This guy has to work at it. He is smart, but he also has to work at it. And he's maybe typical or stereotypical in that, yes, he's book smart, but pretty inept when it comes to social interactions and asking girls out and things like that. But what's different about Nash is he really wants to make an original contribution to the field of mathematics. Most of the time, people do derivative work based on somebody else's work, but to come up with a new theory is really an additional challenge. And we're going to see how maybe that plays a factor in how he faces some difficulties, because he is trying to carve out a new path, not just following along and standing on the shoulders of giants that have gone before him. Now, with this, it gives him a sense of self-importance that, it's more important to make an original contribution than it is to maybe do a derivative work. So he thinks kind of highly of himself, at least in that regard, at least with his mind and his mathematical work. Absent-minded, we see this a lot. He seems to be less concerned about the things that normally concern most people, and he's doesn't really play by the rules of life, even the ones that are for his life that he's supposed to play along with, because he is so consumed by his mind, by the workings of a genius mind. And eventually he does become schizophrenic with these hallucinations that he really feels to be real. And at some point, once he realizes that's what's going on and admits it and surrenders to that fact, he then takes on the mental illness as it were a math problem, that there is a solution, there is a problem, there are theories, there are hypotheses, they get tested and checked, and if one or more seems to work, then that would be a line to follow in healing this mental illness that he has. And eventually he winds up winning the Nobel Prize for his original work in the field of math. So that's John Nash, our hero. And the lover in this is an actual lover. It is Alicia. Was a student when he started teaching after he got out of Princeton, out of grad school. She's very smart, of course. Creative. She sees things in a different way than Nash does. Now, not that Nash isn't creative, but she has another way of looking at things, a way that Nash doesn't. So this adds to his total makeup, having somebody like this in his life. And she is loyal and loving, nurturing, everything that, a strong feminine archetype, whether it's a man or a woman, doesn't matter so much, but it's that archetypal energy and qualities. And also, like we see again with the lover, it's not just the person and having a lover and being in love with this person. It's beyond that. It's what's creative and real and beautiful and natural, whereas Nash is consumed with numbers and math and paper and theorems and equations and things like that. She's about heartbeat and body temperature and the very visceral, real things in human interaction that he is not only lacking in skill, but if it wasn't for her, it'd be lacking in his life. So she really is a strong character, stronger than him in a lot of ways, by sticking with him and really being courageous and fearless to face up to these demons that are inside her husband's head. So that's Alicia, the lover. Now we have these projections, and there are 3 of them. I'm calling them ally opponents because they seem to be friends at first, but as time goes on, we see that they're really not all that helpful. They're actually pulling Nash apart. And the first one we see very early on when Nash gets to Princeton, and he's settling into his dorm room, this obnoxious drunk Englishman comes in, calls himself the prodigal roommate, that he's arrived, and he's wild, he's obnoxious, he's loud, he's spontaneous. Again, he's almost that animal nature, unfiltered, just says and blurts out whatever he wants to do. Very much the opposite of Nash. And but the good thing is that he is somewhat of a positive influence in that he stirs things up a little bit and gets Nash to really step out of his hardened shell and maybe express a different side of him. Of course, at the end, with the rest of them, Nash has to let them go because by indulging these projections way too much, these hallucinations, they become more and more real to him. Interesting point, too, when he arrives, and this is interesting about all three of his hallucinations, his imaginary friends, each one shows up at a particular time, at a particular event. We're just talking about soul loss with a traumatic event. In this case, this is the day that Nash is settling into his dorm. He looks out the window and he sees some young college students walking by, laughing and giggling, probably having more of a normal college experience at Princeton, whereas Nash knows that that's not why he's there. He's there to do serious business, serious work, and very important work. And then you get this party animal that just shows up in his room. So my guess is that this is this time in Nash's life, in his process, where he seems that he's lost that. Not that he ever really had it. It never really seems like he was a party animal, but nevertheless, once he sees that that's something outside of him, something separate from him, that he is different now, he no longer has that as an option, that this broken piece then shows up, materializes in this hallucination, which Nash feels is quite real. As we move along at the Act 1 turning point, the threshold in between the departure and the initiation, he gets another imaginary friend showing up. Of course, at the beginning, we're not exactly sure if these people are real or not, kind of question it. It doesn't take too long before we really begin to question what's going on in Nash's head. And this guy Parcher, he calls himself Big Brother. He has this very serious tone and needs Nash to do the secret work because the Russians are doing this, and he has to find patterns in magazine advertisements to find some coded messages that will somehow find this bomb or some, cloak and dagger kind of stuff, Cold War things. And this person, this imaginary person, Parcher, shows up right after Nash did some real work at the Pentagon, helping to crack a code. So this is another turning point in his path, Nash's unfoldment, that, now he's doing something serious. So he had this one job at the Pentagon, and now all of a sudden he feels, oh my gosh, now I'm a different person now. Oh, I have this secret side, and that feeds his paranoia. And further, his notions of self-importance, that, I'm doing something, I can't talk about this, this is so important. Of course, it's all imaginary, we find out later. So that's Parcher, he's the second of the projections. And the third one is Marcee, this young, innocent girl. And she comes in at a very interesting time as well. This is right after Nash and Alicia. They've had a date, I think a couple dates by then, and they deepen their connection, if you know what I mean. And then the very next day, Marcee shows up, along with Herman. But she shows up as this innocence and purity that has been lost. So whatever notions that Nash may have had about Alicia being pure and innocent, well, when he sleeps with her, I guess that goes out the window, that illusion. And then the next day, Marcee shows up. So this very childlike, she is a child, but it's that energy. It's the archetypal energy. It's not just the person. It's really the purpose and what it solves. So that way he can keep these things alive. This party animal that he never was, this cloak and dagger that he never really, CIA spy that he never really was, even though he did a little bit of work. And then this innocent, feminine purity character that once that's lost. It's a way of keeping those things alive. Maybe some of those things shouldn't be kept alive. Maybe they shouldn't have been brought to life so much in the first place. But nevertheless, these are the three projections that become very real to Nash. And that's the outer version of what's going on inside his mind. And then by the end, he realizes that these parts of his personality that have been split off, as long as he acknowledges them but doesn't indulge them or engage with them, talk to them, they seem to be okay. They seem to kind of just behave themselves off on the sidelines, which is where they need to be. They're not too happy about that, of course, because they want Nash's attention. But like a lot of demons, a lot of inner difficulties, really the more we feed them, the worse they get. So he learns throughout this story and finally by the end to just leave them alone. And he told them so, that he's not going to talk to them anymore. Didn't completely disappear, but they're not as troublesome as they once were. Okay, now we have Hanson, another seemingly opponent at the beginning. They were very competitive. Their entry into Princeton and this math program also comes with this coveted assignment at this place called the Wheeler Labs. There were only so many spots for that, and we see in this first act, in the departure while they're at Princeton as students, they compete for that, and it doesn't look good for Nash at first. And Hanson is, he's a lot more slick and worldly, and certainly socially way more skilled than Nash, and that feeds his confidence, and he's a little bit arrogant, maybe a little bit of a bully towards Nash at the beginning. But what happens is Nash gets the assignment and Hanson doesn't. So that's where there is a little bit of change there by the end of Act 1. Now, at the end, in the return, in the third act, Nash actually returns to Princeton. And when he gets there, it turns out that Hanson is now the president of Princeton. And he becomes an incredible ally. Very forgiving, very caring, very nurturing, helps Nash come back, gives him a place. He can audit classes, even offered to have him teach a class. And there's a really nice bookend with Nash and Hanson. It takes place very early on and very, very late in the movie, and that's a game of Go that they play. At the beginning, Hanson creams him, and Nash is upset, knocks over the game table and all the little pieces, and gets laughed at, and it's just a horrible mess. And at the end, of course, these men are much older now, and they sit down and have a game of Go, probably in the same table that they had decades earlier, and it's just a friendly game. No competition, no really, cutthroat, going after each other. Just a couple old guys enjoying a nice sunny day and playing a game of Go. So that's his relationship to Hanson. Now we have another character, Dr. Rosen, who really doesn't show up until right in the middle of the middle act, the middle of the initiation at this midpoint. He shows up when Nash has his meltdown trying to give a speech about something and sees the projections, and finally he corners him and gives him a shot and subdues him and commits him to the institution. But Hanson still thinks that the hallucinations are real. He's not convinced, even though he's been institutionalized and these team of experts are saying, no, these are hallucinations. He still doesn't believe it. He still doesn't want to believe it, really. Can't accept it. Very hard for him. Why not? Somebody with such a strong mind. The last thing they'd ever think of themselves as being is crazy and schizophrenic. But that happens. And eventually, of course, Nash comes around and sees that Rosen is correct in what is going on with Nash, although he disagrees on the treatment method. Okay, and to that, here is where we meet Rosen, is when he is giving this speech and just falls apart, total meltdown. And now, once he's institutionalized, we understand his situation a lot better, although by this time I'm pretty sure we, even first time watching it, we know that this is really going on in Nash's mind, but we learn more about it. So the secret is open. This is like the point of no return. Now, even though Nash won't accept it yet, the cat is out of the bag. Okay, we know, Alicia knows, we also know what it is, and their treatment options. But it's out in the open. You can't really go back. You can't put the cat back in the bag, I guess, after letting it out. So that's the point of no return, right in the middle with Nash. And that takes us on a new journey. Well, it's still the same journey in a way, but it's more intensified now. Now we know it's paranoid schizophrenia that's troubling Nash, and he can no longer hide it. That's what has changed. That's where you can't return. Although he still tries to hide it from himself, can't hide it from the rest of us because we know. Now this continues on as it does until we reach this crisis point, this initiation part that's the appointment with death. It is almost an actual death because he's involved with these projections and hallucinations. He drops the ball on giving the baby a bath, and the thing almost drowns. Alicia comes in and saves the baby, calls up Dr. Rosen, and then Parcher shows up in Nash's mind, thinking that she's going to wreck the whole operation and threatens to kill her. And he ends up trying to hit Parcher. Of course, he's not there, and he ends up hitting Alicia. She gets out of the house and leaves him. And then it hits him. He finally realizes that these hallucinations are really not real. And the way he recognizes this is that Marcee, I guess years later, is still the same child that she was when they met. So that's when his mind finally kicked in and said, oh my gosh, they can't be real. She never grows up. She never grows old. So that's this death, the death of the illusion, death of him trying to convince himself that these things are real. And it's a total moment of surrender. He has to really give up everything that he was holding on to and admit that he has a problem and commit to working on solving it. So that's the appointment with death. And then, as I mentioned before, Nash, for the return for Act 3, he actually literally returns to Princeton. So we are at the same place we were at the beginning. And he reunites with Hanson, gets set up, he has free reign of the library to work on his theories and do things like that. We see in this bottom picture, that's where they're having their second game of Go. And also in Princeton, this second time around at the end, as with the first time, we witness a pen ritual in the first act in the departure. We see a professor, a well-respected professor, being given pens by colleagues and to recognize and honor this person who is going to be awarded something very special for their contributions. And the Nobel Prize Committee, I guess, has picked Nash to receive an award for mathematics. And he's in the same place that he was decades before when he saw this, and then one by one these people come up and give their pens to Nash. So this is another bookend, and we can see the first time he just watched he was a student who couldn't figure out his thesis statement. That's a lot of us. Watching this pen ritual for somebody who made a contribution, and then at the end, he is the one who has made the contribution that is recognized, and people are giving their pens to him. So a couple little bookends there. And, and also might make a note that Hanson, in a way, doesn't really change. We don't see him all throughout the middle. We just see him at the beginning act and then the final act. But he was at Princeton at the beginning. He's at Princeton in the end. I don't know what he did in the meantime. But in movie world, he never left. We see him there, and then we come back to Princeton years later, and he's still there, of course, in a different position. But in that way, he doesn't really change. Of course, he grows on his own. He goes from being a student to being the president of the university, which is terrific. But by him kind of staying the same, or at least staying in the same place, against that, we can see all the changes, the ups, the downs, and then the back up again that happened with the life of John Nash and his beautiful mind in this movie, A Beautiful Mind. And I hope you enjoy it, and I look forward to your comments in this week's forum discussion prompts. All right, thanks.